Joseph Kabuleta writes elegantly and speaks eloquently. He recently traded places, sports journalism for evangelism.
Not change the fact that God manufactured this earth to last a certain period of time.
His acolytes who listen to him preach at the pulpit are ready to eat out of the palm of his hands. But it's his intrepid spirit and ability to practice the adage, publish and be damned, that has placed him on a collision path with government. Beyond the narrow traditional space which often recedes at the whims and fancies of the regime, cyberspace has handed a potent weapon to those with a craft to take on the state on subjects it deems uncomfortable to debate in the public sphere. To counter this platform, the regime has applied the law as a tool to exercise political control and restrict freedom of expression. On Friday evening, police arrested evangelist Joseph Kabuleta alongside a colleague, Godwin Masiko, at Forest Mall, Lugogo, Kampala. He's now facing the charges of offensive communication against the president under Section 25 of the Computer Misuse Act and is being held at the Special Investigation Unit, Kireka.
Back to the Computer Misuse Act, it's an act of Parliament, and these are laws that actually came into being, and with the police as the enforcer of the law. However, when such laws come into effect, there is a duty of the law reform that have the mandate of ensuring that such laws are widely disseminated, awareness is promoted, such that all beneficiaries, users, the wider public are aware of the contents and provisions of such laws.
The police said he disturbed the person of the president in his utterances. Do we have a crime that is described in any of our penal laws or in the Computer Misuse Act as disturbing the person of the president, which to my knowledge does not exist? Even when you look at the Penal Code Act, the section that talks about disturbance of the person of the president honestly talks about annoying and ridiculing by way of acts or inciting people to harm him or to strike, which does not fall within the ambit of electronic use. And the Computer Misuse Act does not define anything to do with doing such acts as amounting to abuse of person of a president. So I think right now we can safely say that there has been wrongful charge against him as far as Section 25 is concerned.
I think the uniqueness of the Computer Misuse Act is that it revives the archaic laws that were used by the colonialists to muzzle those who came against the government. And obviously it takes root in a dictatorial regime where you come out strongly to speak against the impunity within the government. Now that juxtaposed with the freedoms under the Constitution, under Article 29 of the Constitution, which is the supreme law of the land, the citizens have a right to express themselves. Now obviously others may argue that this right is not an absolute right. It can be limited under Article 43. But you see, under Article 43 of the Constitution, the standards are very clear. One shouldn't be under public order. Then the most important aspect under Article 43 is that it should be reasonably justifiable in a free and democratic state. Now that sets the standard whenever you want to limit any human rights, especially one which is deeply entrenched in the Constitution, like the freedom of expression. So what the Computer Misuse Act actually comes out to do is that it violates, the section that is being used violates actually the position under the Constitution of the Republic of Uganda. And because of that, there is a whole, not only limitation, but derogation.
Police claim the writer repeatedly posted grossly offensive messages under the headline Joseph Kabuleta Weekly Rant and referred to the president as a gambler, thief and liar, contrary to Section 25 of the Computer Misuse Act 2011. The evolving media landscape has granted a safety net on cyberspace beyond the gated community where the state uses a compliant media as a cog in its transactional politics. This has given rise to those who speak power to the truth. Kabuleta and others have adopted the publish and be damned adage and are not ready to play within the ambit of traditional media. This comes with consequences, as Ssenyonga warns.
Because sometimes there is a lot of excitement on social media. People simply post, simply share, without knowing the repercussions of what it is that they are sharing. But as you are aware, however ignorant you are about the law, it's no defense.
To the regime, the purveyors of such crass and embellished commentary that ridicules the president and those close to him must be punished. Kabuleta is a man with many gifts. He was once part of the newsroom where he tormented wayward sports administrators with a pen in his Sunday column. But he recently traded the pen for the pulpit. For those who thought the gospel would turn him into a meek lamb, were in for a shock.
There is resistance, there is anger, there is vitriol, but he's on top.
Eventually, his stubborn streak began to emerge. Whereas Kabuleta does not preach fire and brimstone, his ministry, for the short span of time it has existed, has challenged the evangelical status quo. He's not a praise singer as expected of other Pentecostal pastors accustomed to paying blind loyalty to the regime. Like the conductor of the orchestra, Kabuleta began to command influence amongst young Pentecostal adherents.
I think previously the state used to control the Balokole movement because, number one, many of them were uneducated. Number two, many of them were very poor. And many of them were unlearned about the contemporary affairs. And obviously, one of the things that the state always wants to do is to keep religion out of politics, but forgetting that religious people are citizens that actually are a part of the politics. And either way, the politicians rule the religious people. Now, one of the things that causes this whole muzzling of the Balokole is when you have prominent figures like Kabuleta coming up.
With the evangelical constituents numbering millions firmly in the grip of the regime, apprehension began to creep in when Kabuleta began to write about what is deemed as sensitive subjects.
New vision, and obviously used to speak a lot of things that would ruffle feathers in the sports fraternity. He turns out to be a very ardent follower of Prophet Elvis Mbonye, a man that he has diligently served, but he also runs an independent ministry which is called the Watchman Ministries. Now, obviously, he has come out strongly, given that expressing his right as a citizen to speak out against the impunity, specifically about the first family, about the president, Museveni, and about the first son.
Scores read his missives on social media platforms. To his adoring fans, his articles were part of his expressions with brutal candor, but the view from his critics was starkly different. He had stepped out of the boundaries and had rebelled against the unwritten credo expected of Pentecostal pastors. He now joins a list including scholar Stella Nyanzi and Timothy Kalyegira, a journalist to be charged under the Computer Misuse Act. In February, the Uganda Law Society petitioned the Constitutional Court seeking the declaration of two sections of the Computer Misuse Act of 2011 as null and void. According to the petition, they are seeking a declaration that sections 24 and 25 of the Computer Misuse Act 2011 are inconsistent with or in contravention of Article 29(1)A and Article 28(12) of the Constitution and are null and void. Section 24 and 25 of the Computer Misuse Act creates the offense of cyber harassment, in particular the use of a computer to make obscene requests or threatening to inflict injury to any person or property. State actors often argue that whereas there's freedom of expression and other rights, there's a general public interest limitation on human rights and freedoms in Article 43 of the Constitution. Uganda has quite a rich jurisprudence on freedom of expression. It was subject of a debate in the 2004 landmark decision of the Supreme Court in Ssenyonga and another versus the Attorney General. The plank of the appeal from the Constitutional Court was whether Section 50 of the Penal Code Act, which made by then publication of false news a criminal offense, contravened the protection of individual rights of expression. Justice Joseph Mulenga, who wrote the lead judgment, which struck down Section 50 of the Penal Code Act, opined that, subject to the limitation under Article 43, a person's expression or statement is not precluded from the constitutional protection simply because it's thought by another or others to be false, erroneous, controversial, or unpleasant. It read further, everyone is free to express his or her views. Indeed, the protection is most relevant and required when a person's views are opposed or objected to by society or part thereof as false or wrong.
It indicated that Mr. Kabuleta has been charged under Section 25 of the newly passed Computer Misuse Act. And I think right now the question we're trying to address is the legality and constitutionality of that section. Because on one side we have Article 29 of the 1995 Constitution that talks about the freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And then on the other hand, we have Section 25 of the Computer Misuse Act that says that any person who willfully and repeatedly uses electronic media to disturb the peace and quiet of a person or their privacy commits a misdemeanor, which is a crime, a small crime, so to say. But then again, we need to bear in mind that although the Constitution enshrines the freedom of speech and expression, it can be limited, and that is under Article 43. And that article stipulates that the limitations can only be if it is just and fair, acceptable in a just and fair democratic society. And I think that is where we start to look at it, because if Uganda is a democratic society, then things like critiquing leaders in position should be acceptable. Because if I see something wrong, then as a concerned citizen, I have a right to say that something is wrong.
How do we make it applicable, and how do we test whether it's still applicable and relevant? You look at the case law, because the laws have been tested at different levels. We've made different arguments at the different courts of law. Think about the case, the most prominent case of Charles Ssenyonga versus the Attorney General, where the test again came on the freedom of expression. And the party in question was, the parties in question were actually journalists. And the court goes ahead to say that it is the fundamental human rights which are fundamental, not the limitation. Now, what the police and the government are doing is that they are fronting the limitation of the human right as opposed to the protection and preservation of the human right. Number two, in that case, when they refer to the case of Reverend Dr. Christopher Mitikila versus the Attorney General, the one that is that the freedom of expression is the fundamental root in a democratic state. So when you're interpreting Article 43 on the limitation of the human rights, about a human right, before you limit, must be the limitation must be reasonably justifiable in a free and democratic state. What's a democratic state? One where people are allowed to express their civic liberties, such as speaking out against the impunities. Number two, the standard of expressing yourself is not whether you annoy or speak pleasant things against the person of the president or any individual who is put in question.
But quoting an excerpt from an article by Archibald Cox, a law professor who served as U.S. Solicitor General under President John F. Kennedy, Mulenga ruled that a democratic society respects and promotes the citizens' individual right to freedom of expression because it derives benefits from the exercise of that freedom by its citizens. In order to maintain that benefit, a democratic society chooses to tolerate the exercise of the freedom, even in respect of demonstrably untrue and alarming statements, rather than to suppress it.
We have jurisprudence from the US which almost every country looks up to. Trump, one of the most hated presidents alive, he's abused each and every day on TV, on news. I mean, he has come to the level of calling some houses houses that produce fake news, but he has not gone ahead to arrest anyone or put them in prison simply because they've called him an idiot or a foolish president or the worst that there has ever been. And I think that for us is something we should learn from.
In the South African case, The Citizen and Others versus McBride, Justice Edwin Cameron postulated that criticism should be protected even if extreme, unjust, unbalanced, exaggerated and prejudiced, so long as it expresses an honestly held opinion without malice on a matter of public interest on facts that are true. According to the European Court of Justice, the only content-based restriction is to deal with the dissemination of ideas promoting racism and the Nazi ideology, denying the Holocaust and incitement to hatred and racial discrimination. The court relied on Article 17 of the Convention and held that freedom of expression may not be used to lead to the destruction of the rights and freedoms guaranteed by the European Convention on Human Rights. Such decisions apply the theory of the paradox of tolerance, and absolute tolerance may lead to the tolerance of ideas promoting intolerance, and the latter could then destroy the tolerance.
In Europe, they have basically used these laws to handle huge issues that concern the society, issues of genocide and anti-Semitism, rather than someone who has come up to critique a regime and show it what ought to or what ought not to be done.
However, the European Court of Justice fundamentally states that freedom of expression constitutes one of the essential foundations of such a society, one of the basic conditions for its progress and for the development of every man. The state has many avenues to counter any narratives that may be misleading or peppered with falsehoods, but arresting those who are critical or write falsehoods is akin to killing a fly with a sledgehammer. Emmanuel Mutaiziwa, NTV.